I want to thank the Police and Justice Foundation for having me here. You know, they've been thanking me for being here, and to be honest with you, it is a privilege, it is an honor to be here with you. You know, when you come to a ceremony like this and you hear about, you know, Officer Jonathan Burnett and Natasha Hunter, you just feel like you all are in the right place at the right time, honoring those officers who both live and die to protect the citizens of New Orleans. So I always feel great if I'm fortunate enough to be invited to speak here. And I wanted to thank the Mayor, Mayor Landrieu, who's a good friend of mine and really tremendous leadership for his hospitality. And Bob Brown, the chairman, and Melanie Talia, just for what they've done. This is a great foundation. 21 years you've been doing this. There are certain things police departments cannot do, they cannot afford on their own. And you have done things that are incredibly important. So thank you all for what you're doing. I'm going to come back to the superintendent at the end here. But I want to talk to you for a few minutes just about what this last 2 years have been like. You know, it's hard to not turn on the TV these days. When there isn't a video on TV, I'm always surprised. You know, with 18,000 police departments in this country, 700,000 officers, and millions of daily encounters, and with the proliferation of video cameras and so forth, the American people are seeing a side of policing they hadn't seen, and yet we know that represents part of what goes on, but it doesn't represent all of the encounters that police have every day that don't result in use of force. And certainly with, you know, the death of Natasha Hunter, you know how dangerous this job can be. And just the other day in Palm Springs, excuse me, 2 officers died as a result of you know, just responding to a domestic violence call, just doing their job. One was about to retire, and one had just come back from maternity leave, and they were like, you know, those officers out there in white shirts, those are the future of New Orleans, those brave officers sitting back here, and they were just doing their job. But having said all of that, what we have done and what the superintendent has been part of is we've taken a hard look at policing, and we've really asked ourselves a fundamental question, which is, can we do better? You know, can we do better? And especially in the area of use of force. So let me just, you know, given the limited amount of time, tell you what we have done. We surveyed the policing field. You know, PERF's been around for 40 years. We have 2,500 members. We focus on big city issues. So much like what your foundation did by surveying citizens, we surveyed police departments. And you know what? When we asked them what kind of training the police get, what do you think they said? They said the majority of their training is in firearms, and a small percentage of their time is in de-escalation, crisis intervention, those kinds of things. And so when you look at these officers involved in these situations, we really ask ourselves the question. First of all, we said, you know, we never blame the officers for handling the situation the way they did. We say, look at their training. And so if you look at their training, you realize they've been trained in a way that makes them respond as they have. So we brought together about 250 police chiefs, and we asked them about, you know, training, and we asked them about de-escalation and all of this, and people said that training has to change. And we looked at that, and then I was fortunate, as the superintendent indicated, I work overseas, and I happened to be in Scotland, and the government had hired us to help Police Scotland, an agency of 17,000, and I was at a recruit graduation. And I was with this officer, and this is about 2 months after the Ferguson incident. And I knew in Scotland the police don't have firearms. I mean, they just don't in the United Kingdom. The only one that does is Northern Ireland. And so it occurred to me, after the Washington Post had done this analysis of 1,000 incidents, there's some percentage of those that don't involve firearms, that involve knives, rocks, baseball bats, things like that. And I said to this young officer, I said, well, how do you deal with someone with a knife, with a rock, and so forth? He said, no problem. And he stepped back, and they have OC spray, and he put his hand up like that and began talking. And so it occurred to me that I said, well, why is it that they can do this in these kind of situations that don't involve firearms? Why can't we do this? So I came back to the United States, and I talked to my American friends, and they all, of course, dismissed it, and they said, you know what, that's Scotland, that's not the United States. And I said, okay, that's it. So I brought 25 departments over to Scotland, and 24 out of 25 got it for a week, and we learned what they were doing. But then we came back to the United States. When we were in Scotland, someone said, we're already doing this in the United States. I said, how so? They said, with our SWAT team. You see, our SWAT team is deployed in some of these situations in a way that, this was a person from Houston, where they resolve it. It takes hours and hours. So I thought, so I went to the NYPD, the Emergency Service Unit, talked to Bill Breton, and we started to look at their principles and how you can use time and distance and slow things down in the non-firearm situations. And then January 29th, in a meeting that New Orleans was involved, when we studied all of this, and we came out with these guidelines on use of force. And these guidelines on use of force were just adopted by the Chicago Police Department the other day. You'll hear New Orleans has already. New Orleans was one of the police departments we learned about these things from. These were not our ideas. But we came out with these guiding principles on use of force, and no sooner had we come out with them when the largest union and the largest police chief organization denounced us. And we thought, well, you know, why would they do that? And I think a lot of it is change is hard in this profession. But so we went from that place to putting those guidelines out to we are now piloting training. But let me tell you about that analysis the Washington Post did. They looked at shootings involving deadly force, 1,000, approximately 25% involved mental illness, 10% involved unarmed subjects, 16% involved people with a knife, and 5% involved subjects using as a weapon. And what we said is that in probably 30 to 40%, we think we can make an impact. And so we started out with that premise. First premise is, we said, number one, is the sanctity of human life should be at the heart of everything the police department does. And that, I'm proud to tell you, is in the New Orleans policy. The New Orleans policy says, the policy of the New Orleans Police Department is to value and preserve human life when using lawful authority to use force. Second, we said the department should hold themselves to a higher standard than Graham versus Connor. Graham versus Connor says, all claims that law enforcement officials have used excessive force, deadly or not, in the course of an arrest, investigative stop, or other seizure of a free citizen are properly analyzed under the Fourth Amendment's objective reasonableness standard, rather than a substantive due process standard. The reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than 20/20 vision of hindsight. So what that really says is, the reason people look at some of these situations and they ask themselves, well, why wasn't the police officer, why wasn't something done? The police officer in many of these situations has a reasonable fear for his or her life and acts appropriately. But what departments have done and New Orleans have done is say, we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. So they create policies, they establish training, they do all the things a department should do. New Orleans is one of the departments that is moving forward. You know, I'm from Boston, I'm a big New England Patriots fan. I would say New Orleans is on offense rather than defense. You are ahead of where some other departments are. And, you know, look, you had some difficult situations, but a lot of the principles we've adopted come from New Orleans. For example, shooting at vehicles. In 1972, the NYPD, this is 40 years ago, put in this policy: do not discharge firearms at or from a moving vehicle unless deadly physical force is being used against an officer or another person present by means other than the moving vehicle. New Orleans has this policy in place, and yet 40 years later some departments don't. And why is this significant? Why is that one policy significant? I'll tell you why. Because when an officer pulls over a car and he believes it's stolen, and the department doesn't have this policy, and he or she stands in front of that car and pulls out their gun and aims it at a 17-year-old in the car, and that 17-year-old thinks, well, he's going to get out of the way. I'm going to get out of here because I'll get in trouble at home for being in a stolen car. So you have this maximum feasible misunderstanding. The car starts to come to the officer. The officer, fearing for their life, shoots the driver. So what do you have? You have a dead 17-year-old for a stolen car. Now, did the officer commit a crime? No, the officer didn't commit a crime. He or she feared for his life. But the department has a responsibility to have had the right policy and training. So you get that officer out of the way, you don't want them to get hurt. But you just say, you know, we're not going to kill someone over a stolen car. That's where the proportionality, that's where the sanctity of human life is. But even today, some departments think that's controversial. And they'll come up with all sorts of reasons. You know, what if it's a suicide bomber and they're about to go to a school? Well, 40 years the New York City Police Department has had that in place, and it has not resulted in any officer getting hurt. And imagine how many people live because of it. And New Orleans has that policy. And so that's really significant. This is important, and I think this is probably where New Orleans really deserves a lot of credit. And we call it the duty to intervene. Officers need to prevent other officers from using excessive force. Now, many of you, I hope, are old enough to remember the Rodney King incident. The big takeaway for police chiefs in the Rodney King incident was what the officers did was bad. But what the supervisors did was worse. The supervisors stood there and let that happen. So back then in the Rodney King incidents 20 years ago, the department started to put duty to intervene. Well, New Orleans has gone a step further, and that is New Orleans has the Ethical Policing and Courageous Peer Intervention Program, which we wrote about in our newsletter. We focused on this. Now, why is that so important? It's important because if you just say to police officers, you know, you should intervene. Think about it. Policing is like everything else in life. It has a culture, and the culture says, you know, you back up your officer and so forth. But intervening is not necessarily something that we teach as well as we could. But New Orleans, through this EPIC program, actually teaches their officers how to intervene, that it's a good thing to intervene. Do you know, if you think about it, an officer is helping another officer, if he or she is losing their cool, taps him on the shoulder and says, hey, time out, let me handle this. Before, we call this going upstream, before it gets bad. So I just wanted to recognize New Orleans for that EPIC program. And those recruits back there, they'll probably all be trained in it, and they'll be the recipients of it. And you know what? It's going to save lives, and it's going to save careers. We have now finished pilot testing training based upon the intersection of crisis intervention and tactics. That is what is missing in policing. CIT, crisis intervention training, has been around for 20 years. But when you look at some of these incidents, the thing that occurs to us is, why, if those officers were trained in crisis intervention, did this incident unfold the way it is? That is because there hasn't been an intersection between crisis intervention, communication, and tactics. So we have piloted this testing, this training in 7 agencies, and on Sunday in San Diego, we will release this report, and I think it's going to make a difference. So that's, in a nutshell, what we have been doing. I want to say something about New Orleans, too, and I want to say something about Mike Harrison, because it's interesting, because he thanked me, but I really want to thank him. We were in Chicago the other day, and I brought together, through the MacArthur Foundation, I was able to bring 25 members of the Baltimore Police Department, the command staff, community, and union people together with the Chicago Police Department. And we sat down, there was about 50 of us. Both of these departments had one incident each. Baltimore had the Freddie Gray case, and Chicago had the Laquan McDonald case. Both those cities were impacted by one incident in each city, and it had tremendous impact. Department of Justice investigations, consent decrees, all of that stuff. There were kind of people in the room were quite honestly, it was a very good, candid conversation. We had community people there, and we're looking for some inspiration. And your superintendent got up and he spoke, and he said, you know what, New Orleans has been where you've been before. We faced what you faced before. And he said, we had to make some decisions. Do we fight this consent decree, or do we embrace it and move forward? And he said, you know what? We embrace it and move forward. And he said something funny. He says, you know what? Sometimes you have to shoot a hostage to show people you're serious. And everybody knew what he meant, because in policing, it's like everything in life. People don't want to change. And he was very, he has credibility. Now people are coming from all across the country to see what New Orleans is doing, how New Orleans is making progress. And at the beginning of the meeting, I don't know if you heard it, but they were talking about the results of a citizen survey. And I looked at those numbers, and that's another thing that you're doing, right? It is you're measuring your progress. It's hard too. How do you measure if you're doing well? I mean, you can't measure, you can't look at it by the number of homicides or so forth, up or down. That number is going to fluctuate. But you can measure citizen satisfaction, and in some parts of that survey talk about integrity and talk about people's trustworthiness of the department, and those numbers are going up. So it's just a way of measuring your effectiveness. But you did something, and this is what I want to say, what the superintendent alluded to. Through your generous support, you allowed the superintendent in 2014 to come to our program up in Boston. Now, you may not think that's a big deal, but it's an expensive program. It's almost $10,000, and New Orleans has not always been able to afford it, and yet other departments are able to do that. Because you gave him that training, it helped him prepare. There's other people in this department who could benefit from it too. So sometimes I'm sure when you come to things like this, you ask yourself, what are we doing? Is it really having a benefit? Well, the benefit is in Mike Harrison there and what he's doing for this department. Let's give him a round of applause. So I want to thank New Orleans. You got some good news here. I mean, look, is New Orleans out of the woods yet? No, but they got a path, they got a direction, and with your help, they're going to make it. Thank you all very much.